I think that's the heart of the question we're asking today. And the question there is there a trade-off between having more landlords and making housing a better investment and having more home ownership? And I think there is. There is a symmetry to housing. And yeah, this is the great dilemma, but it's not a new one. One thing I often quote to people is when a famous visitor to Sydney observed that the number of homes recently built is astounding. Nevertheless, everyone complains of the high rents and difficulty in procuring a house. Now, that was Charles Darwin in 1836 when he arrived in Sydney, population 20,000. So it's not a new problem that we need to deal with it, but you're right, that's the heart of the issue, is the haves and the have-nots, and how is the best way to help the have-nots.
OK, but at the heart of the question, Catherine, if I could go to you, is the idea that some people have no housing and some people have multiple houses. Is it fair?
Yeah, I'm not sure is it fair is how I'd answer that. I'd say it's something that we need to be ashamed of. This is one of the richest countries in the world, and yet those families that are suffering the highest level of vulnerabilities are the ones most overrepresented in those numbers. And when you think about what we're looking at in the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, 20% of the people that have nowhere to live are our families. In the Northern Territory, 90% of the people who don't have anywhere to live are our people. When you look at what housing is available, again, grossly overrepresented. We're looking at stats like 34% of the housing available to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people has major structural flaws, and 20% of current housing for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people would be considered not fit to live in. That's something we should be ashamed of. So it's more like, is it a disgrace? Yeah, I don't think anyone could describe it as anything less than a disgrace.
Andrew, Leigh, how does it sit with you that there is such a disparity?
No, I think Isabelle is completely right, and it's not something that's inevitable. My grandfather, Rolly Stebbins, was born in a tent in Queensland in 1922. After the World War II, they didn't have very much, but they had a federal government that was willing to expand housing policy. And under the Chifley government, and then continued under the Menzies government, they built a house in Williamstown. He and his wife Jean raised my mum and her sister and brothers in a home where my grandfather was making the bricks in his own little kiln with his mates whenever they had a little bit more money. That was a period where home ownership peaked. Not because we allowed people to rip money out of their savings accounts, not because we ran some sort of a housing lottery, but because we invested in supply. And fundamentally, the problem, Isabella, is that we're not building enough homes. We've got about 4 homes for every 10 Australians, and that's low for the advanced world. We've got to build more homes. So the Housing Australia Future Fund, the New Homes Bonus, the Social Housing Accelerator, all the policies you'll hear the federal government talking about is about getting more housing supply out there after a period where housing supply has fallen below population and home prices have gone through the roof.
Andrew Bragg, you heard the question. How do you respond to it?
Well, I mean, it is a problem of supply. We haven't built enough houses. Unfortunately, though, the problem's getting worse. And in the last year, we've had 670,000 new migrants come in and only 170,000 houses being built. So it's getting much harder under Labor to get the houses we need to house our children. So equally, on the demand side, for people who might have a bit of money, for example, in super, they can't even use their own money to buy a house. So basically, it is very hard to get a house when the country isn't building enough houses and we have these ridiculous rules which stop people from using their own money.
OK, we're going to get into some of those issues. Max, I really think it's important to address Isabella's question about some people having lots of houses and some people having none.
It's deeply unfair, and what's really unfair is the federal government hands out billions of dollars in tax handouts to property investors who own multiple homes. Like, do you want to know what the biggest line item in the budget for housing was in the last budget? It was $27 billion in tax handouts for property investors. That's what the government spent most on housing in the last budget. And what that means is if you are a first home buyer going to an auction, you're going to that auction and you're losing to a property investor because they can use negative gearing and the capital gains tax discount to bid up the price of housing and screw over first home buyers. It's deeply, deeply unfair. And There's a reason that both the representatives from the Labor and Liberal Party mentioned supply but failed to talk about demand.
Well, supply matters.
Well, sure, but as long as you are dishing out, so over the next 10 years, the PBO has said that tax handouts for all property investors in the budget will cost $500 billion, $500 billion. As long as the government is dishing out that amount of money to property investors to go and hoover up homes, so 10, 20, 30 investment properties, we're never going to fix this housing crisis. So our job is to make sure both those major parties know that it is politically popular to phase out negative gearing and capital gains tax discounts, and it's politically necessary.
OK, Rose?
Yeah, I mean, I agree that there's very little about our housing market at the moment that is fair. And, you know, I come from Sydney, and in Sydney we have a situation where 70,000 30 to 40-year-olds left our city in the last few years and only 35,000 arrived. So we are losing a generation of young people in the great city of Sydney, and housing is a core reason for that. So very little about our housing market is fair at the moment. I think there's actually kind of broad agreement on that, which is good. The question is what we do about it.
Yeah, that's right.
And I have to say, I am of the view that fundamentally we can't solve the problem within the confines of the housing market that we have currently. We have to change, and we have to build more homes. It's not enough.
Do you think it's just a supply issue,
No,
though?
I don't. I don't think it's just a supply issue. I don't think it's just a tax issue. I don't think it's just an Airbnb issue. I don't think it's just a planning issue.
But is it all those things? Is it tax as well? Does it all have to be on the table?
Yeah, I think it does all have to be on the table, and we've got ourselves into such a dysfunctional quagmire and mess that everyone does have to come to the table, and certainly that includes state governments, and I'm not trying to abdicate our responsibility here. We've got work to do, but so does the Commonwealth, and so does local government here. And I think, sure, it's, you know, easy answers are always attractive. Yeah, talk about migrants, but, you know, this isn't Sky After Dark. Talk about tax, sure, talk about all those things. But fundamentally, we've got to acknowledge that if there was a lever to pull or a button to press and it was that easy, governments would have done it. Fundamentally, it is challenging. But in answer to Isabelle's question, no, it's not fair. And there's a lot of work to do to get our housing market back to somewhere resembling a fair distribution of the housing assets.
Rose is right. This is the ABC After Dark.